in 1 Corinthians 6. He says, "Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and you are not your own, for you are bought with a price. Therefore bring honor to God in your body and in your spirit, which are His." We have this promise found back in the book of Exodus, chapter 15 and verse 26. "If you will with diligence heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and give ear to His commandments, and keep His statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you that you experienced and saw when in Egypt." That's a precious promise. And as we face this so-called pandemic, it's a promise we can claim. We need not have any fear. We have the 91st Psalm. 1,000 may fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come nigh or near you, because you've made the Lord, who is the God of heaven, the center of your life and the power in your choices and in your emotions and in your decisions and in your thinking. When God is first in our life, we need not have fear of anything. We have this promise in the 103rd Psalm where it says, "Bless the Lord who heals all of your diseases." Every moment we're living, our bodies are engaging in a healing process. Whether we consider ourselves sick or well, we are being healed moment by moment through the entire and incredible processes of physiology God has established in our being. It says, "It is He who satisfies your mouth with good things, His wonderful foods that He's created. In Eden, He made the incredible fruits, the nuts, the seeds. Later on, the vegetables were added after sin. We had the curse of sin when Adam and Eve left the garden. We had another curse when Abel was killed by his brother Cain. And we had the most terrible curse at the time of the universal flood. But even so, there's much beauty left. God left the fruits, the wonderful foods for us to partake of. And He said, when we partake of these good things, our youth will be renewed like the eagles. We don't need to be decrepit and weak and sickly in old age. We can live a healthful life right until the time when we do die on this earth and sleep until the resurrection. There's no need for disease at any age by anyone if we will walk in all these statutes faithfully and understand them and practice them. In Exodus 23, we're told, "You will serve the Lord your God, and I will take sickness away from the midst of you." When we visit Adventist churches, we're always hearing this long list of people in the hospital: heart disease, diabetes, cancer, whatever it might be. And it's not necessary if we will understand all the principles of healthful living. And it's not just the physical laws, there are intellectual laws. Negative emotions can create disease. Fear, negative emotions drain the life force. We need to have trust in God, one of those 8 laws of life that we're given. We see here this observation by the psalmist in 105, the 105th Psalm. He says, "He brought them forth with silver and with gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes." And this was a number exceeding 1 million people. So, we have this promise being fulfilled, literally, during the wilderness journey. And it talks here about the fact that if we will observe all the words of this law, we will be blessed. But if we fail to observe them, then upon you and your children will be brought serious and prolonged sickness, or sicknesses. So the reality is that there is a law of cause and effect at work. It's not what we call adventitious or comes out of the blue and hits you in the, unexpectedly. A lot of people will say, "Oh, there's something going around." No, there's nothing going around. It's our habits of life that determine whether we're healthy or sick, whether we're following all the laws and principles that God has given, or whether we're living as the world lives. If we're thinking the way Babylon thinks, if we're eating at the pizza joint, if we're eating at McDonald's, if we're ignoring the principles of life God has given. Most people don't know white sugar is not a food. It has 0 food nutrients. It's a drug. It releases endorphins. And dopamine. That's why it's refer to people who are drug addicts as dopes or dope addicts. And white sugar is a form of dope. So we've got to be very careful in the principles we follow, not compromise. Compromise sinks ships. One leak can ultimately sink a Titanic. And everything we do affects us physiologically and intellectually and spiritually. It says here, I have set before you life and death, blessings and cursings. Therefore choose life, Deuteronomy 30:19. So the choice is ours. God leaves it up to us. He's given us this freedom to choose life or to choose death. We know about our prophet Ellen White. We've been receiving a number of wonderful messages about her ministry. And in her lifetime, we know she received over 2,000 visions. And she pointed out the way of life that God's people need to live if we're to be his end-time people in bringing in his coming, to usher his return through preparing the world. Jesus said, when this message of truth and light and redemption and healing is brought to the whole world, then the end will come. This is a mission yet unfulfilled, and every one of us is to have a role in completing that mission. She made this statement, let physicians teach the people that restorative power is not in drugs, but it is in nature. Disease is an effort of nature to free the system from conditions resulting from violating the laws of health. Nature is to be worked with or assisted as she seeks to expel impurities and reestablish right conditions in the system. She also affirmed in her writings that the Lord doesn't bring many into the truth now because of unconverted and backslidden church members. In fact, she specifically references failure to follow our health counsel, such as using tea and coffee. God will not bring people into our church because he doesn't want them to be brought into compromise. He wants them to be brought into the standards that he has set before us, in which we have no excuse to ignore. It says the selfish, health-destroying indulgences of men and women have counteracted the influence of our message, that is to prepare a people for the great day of God. We're told that this health message is the right arm of the three angels' message. It says some will justify their use of tea and of flesh foods or meat, but this is a great evil. Their habits are not brought into conformity with the will of God. How then will the church be prepared to help those who have newly come into the faith? We have no excuse. We have all the light. True sanctification requires that all of our habits, our eating, our drinking, the way we dress, that we do these to secure preservation of our physical health, our mental and our moral health, that we may present unto the Lord our bodies not as a corrupt offering, but as a living sacrifice that is holy, undefiled, and acceptable unto God. Natural law has a lot to do with perfection. It says if we would live a perfect life, we must live in harmony with those natural laws which govern our being. That's in Testimonies, Volume 3. We're also told that without holiness, no person, no man can see God. There will no one come into his presence who is defiled by bad and evil habits, by selfish choices, by disregarding his counsel, by thinking our wisdom is better than God's, or God doesn't really mean what he says, when God means everything that he says. We put ourselves in great peril when we compromise against these evils. In fact, we're told in Testimonies, Volume 2, page 70, it's just as much a sin to violate the laws of our being as it is to break one of the 10 commandments. For we cannot do either without breaking the law of God. The transgression of physical law is the transgression of the law of God. The human being who's careless and reckless in their habits and practices concerning physical life and health are sinning against God. So it's not an option as a Christian. It is a duty and a responsibility that is a sacred obligation. In fact, she says our health is to be as sacredly guarded as our character. For when we disregard this counsel, we're opening up the way for the weakness of mental, intellectual capability, thus setting ourselves up for deceptions of the enemy. One compromise always opens a door to another and another and another, until we end up sliding too far, too fast. We can never recover if we don't wake up and address these issues in their early stages. It says, our habits of eating and drinking show whether we're of the world or among that number whom the Lord by his mighty cleaver of truth has separated from the world. The choice is ours. Are we on the side of the Lord, or are we on the side of Baal? Are we on the side of those in rebellion against God? Do we heed the counsels of Babylon, regularly spouted off through the propaganda of mainstream media, or do you believe God's counsel? Which is true? I'm sorry, go back here. There we go. It says, the Creator said, see, I've given you every plant that yields a seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit bears seed. This shall be your food. This was God's Eden diet. And we're told by God's messenger that this is the diet we should follow as we seek for perfection of character. Remember the story of Daniel and his 3 companions in Babylon. That God led them to make the choice between the king's table and his original diet. And they chose God's way. And they had much greater intellectual power. They stood spiritually strong. We're told that if they had failed on this point, that they would have failed miserably in their time in Babylon. We would have never heard the name Daniel. There would be no book of Daniel written. There would have been another author there. But because he was faithful on this point, God could continue to use him and fill him with his Spirit. But had he chosen to eat what was out there on the table, he would have forfeited God's favor and blessing. He became a great light to the Babylonian kingdom and a great light in the Medo-Persian kingdom. He became a great light to end-time people as we seek to know the truth about prophecy in the future. But if that one failure would have put out the light of his life ministry, he would have gone off into obscurity with his companions. Our small choices have great consequences in life. By precept and example make it plain that the food that God gave to Adam in his sinless state is the best for man as he seeks to regain that sinless state. We must consider this issue of the latter rain, the loud cry, the finishing of God's work. In both the 20th and the current centuries, there have been repeated calls by the leadership of this church for us to pray for revival and the latter rain to fall. So the question I ask is, why has this not yet happened? The answer is simple. It's found in Acts chapter 5, verse 32. The Holy Spirit is given to those who obey him. We cannot walk in a pathway of disobedience, of compromise with the world, and expect to be filled with God's Spirit and to finish his work. Everything we do in life is seed planting that will always bear a harvest. You plant the wrong seeds, you're going to get a bad harvest. You sow the wind, you'll reap the whirlwind. And the reality is that we've been given wonderful counsel. We need to obey that counsel if we would have life. Had the Church of Christ done her appointed work as God ordained, the whole world would have been warned before this, and our Lord Jesus could have come in power and great glory. He could have come a very long time ago. It says we may have to remain here in this world because of insubordination, disobedience, many more years, even as did the children of Israel. But for Christ's sake, we should not blame him for his delayed advent. We have here the establishment of the first health institute established by our church back in Battle Creek, Michigan. It was called the Western Health Reform Institute. And what was interesting, let me go back to that slide just a second. On the lawn of the Health Reform Institute, there were many placards and signs put up. And it says, we use God's healing methods. We follow the laws of nature in order to prevent disease and restore health. We employ good nutrition, as God gave us in the beginning. We employ sleep and rest, sunshine, exercise, fresh water, trust in God. We follow His true remedies. These were the advertisements at the Institute. Can you imagine those signs being set up in front of one of our Adventist hospitals today? Just something to think about. We came in to an incredible work through John Harvey Kellogg, who was a very good man. He did a wonderful work. But in time, the glory and the power and the majesty began to go to his head, and he began to compromise. And he went against God's counsel. He built this massive, massive institution. Finally, he married a non-Adventist woman. Actually, she was a Seventh-day Baptist, I believe. And this misled him in his choices. And he began to ignore the spirit of prophecy. And then he began to write about these pantheistic theories. And the pantheism in his book, The Living Temple, was referred to as the alpha of apostasy. And God's messenger warned that the omega of apostasy would soon follow, and it would be even more dangerous, and it would gradually grow and get greater in power, increasing even until the time of the second advent of our Lord and Savior. And my understanding is, and my belief is that this omega, which is so dangerous, is the abandonment of our church of the true health message. And how that happened was because the living temple alpha apostasy had to do with healing. It had to do with the fact that God is everywhere in nature healing. He's healing people, He's healing plants, He's healing everything, everywhere. The idea that God is everything, God is the creation, came into thinking. And he took things to an extreme. And so what happened is, the devil is very wise. When you take things to an extreme, you call it thesis. And you take things in reaction. There's always, in physics, an equal and opposite reaction. The other extreme was antithesis. In other words, if God is everything and God is doing nothing but healing, then we will take things to the other extreme. We'll separate the message of the gospel from health. We'll separate the work of physicians from pastors. We will separate the health work from the work of the gospel. And that was never, ever God's plan. So the pendulum swung to the other extreme. And it's never come back to the center, which is a balance between the message of God's redemption and the message of God's physical, mental, and spiritual restoration being in balance. The two must always be together. God wanted the physicians and the pastors to work as teams, to have a balanced ministry. At the last General Conference session, God's messenger told everyone assembled, the last GC she spoke at, she said, none of you will be ministers after the gospel order until you include the work of healing in your ministry. The pastors were to be trained in natural healing. Physicians were to be trained in giving gospel messages, and both were to do this as a part of their work, and they were to work together as teams. Okay, let's continue. We have here the home at Elmshaven, and some interesting things happened. Second here, let's go back, sorry. Some interesting things happened during the last years of Ellen White's life. This was just before the establishment of the College of Medical Evangelists, which later became Loma Linda Medical Center University. And at Elmshaven, Ellen White was visited by some church leaders from Southern California. It's a long ride from there to Napa Valley, about a 400-mile train ride. And anyway, they came up to see her, and she met with them. And they said, Sister White, we've been approached by the American Medical Association, where they know we're starting this new medical school and hospital center. They didn't call it hospital, they call it sanitarium. And they said they want us to join with them so that they can bring up our standards and we can fulfill their expectations as the largest medical association. And she said, brothers, God has revealed it very, very clearly. We're to have nothing at all to do with the world system of theology, the world system of health. We're to avoid it. We have a special mission, a special purpose. God's healing methods are unique. No, it's against the light God has given. And instead of graciously accepting her counsel, they were not very happy to hear it. They got up, they got on the train, they headed south. A few months later, they made a second trip. Same request, same response. Another 2-3 months passed, and they wouldn't give up. They came a third time. This time she refused to talk to them. And they just went back. And on their way back, they said, well, I guess she didn't say no this time. And they then joined with the AMA. Very tragic events. And when they did that, it not only impacted our whole medical system, as everything came in over time. Many years ago, my wife worked at St. Helena Sanitarium and Hospital. It's now just a hospital, I believe. And when she was working there, this was way back in the 1980s, they brought flesh food into the diet. It was the last Adventist hospital in North America that wasn't serving flesh food, and they finally gave in while she was working there. It was very sad. Anyway, getting over to the College of Medical Evangelists and Sanitarium, God's purpose for our hospital, she said, we are not to use drugs in our institutions. God has a wonderful system of healing. As we adopt it, the world will come to our door. But that didn't happen. After Ellen White passed away, it was decided that they would build in Los Angeles a hospital in her honor. And they called it White Memorial Hospital. And you would never guess who they invited to be the guest speaker at the dedication of this hospital. The vice president of the American Medical Association. And as he got up from the seat to come to the lectern, he was halfway there, and everything shook. There was a massive earthquake. And as that earthquake occurred, the medical laboratory, which was 3 stories, 3 floors, at the College of Medical Evangelists was split right down the center. And God was showing his displeasure with what was happening. She made this comment writing in Loma Linda Messages, much that is embraced in the medical course is positively unnecessary. Those who take a medical training spend a great deal of time in learning that which is merely rubbish. I have a good friend who, Diane Burnett, she's done a series on amazing discoveries. She was head of the medical program at Uchee Pines Institute. And she believed that most of her medical training was really useless, because if she was to follow God's counsel, 70%, 80% of what she learned had no value and no place in her work as a doctor. And so this raises a lot of questions about the fact that Jesus' coming has been delayed. And I believe it's because of apostasy on the issue of the health message, apostasy in relation to medical education and healthcare. And what happened as well, when the AMA that linkage was made with the American Medical Association, the next thing they said was, we cannot accept any students from any of your schools unless your schools are accredited. And that led our entire education system to abandon the original model. Between the year 1900 and 1920, if someone had a degree, they would not hire you in an Adventist institution because they did not trust the Babylonian system of education. We know from the book Broken Fountains, what is it now? Broken Fountains, Living Cisterns, I think it is. There's this lineage of Western education that goes right back to the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. And it went from there to the University of Lyons in Paris. From there it went to Cambridge and Oxford in England. From there it came over to William and Mary in Virginia, Yale in Connecticut, Harvard in Massachusetts, Princeton in New Hampshire. It came into all these institutions here. Our entire system of education is predicated on the papal system. And we were told by the AMA, you have to embrace the papal system or you're not going to have any medical graduates. And that's what happened. Even Weimar College, this reform institution, they're desperately working on getting accredited. And they have been for years and years and years. Neil Nedley has brought in the nursing curriculum, which means they're teaching all the nurse training being trained there in drugging, because that's part of the requirements of the state of California. So I mean, even our reform institutions are compromising. Very, very sad. She says there are many ways of practicing the healing art, but there's only one way heaven approves. God's remedies are the simple agencies of nature that will not tax and debilitate the system, remedies the want of which thousands are dying for the want of this. These remedies we know are pure air, sunlight, abstemiousness, meaning moderation in eating that which is good. And I know there are some health lecturers who will say a little bit of whatever at the end of a meal is okay, a little bit of compromise. I don't buy that principle because a little bit of a bad thing is never a good thing. Rest, exercise, proper diet, the use of water, trust in divine power, these are the true remedies. It says this is taken from Desire of Ages. It says here, the great healer Christ made use of the simple agencies of nature, and he did not give countenance, that means approval, to drug medication. He sanctioned the use of simple and natural remedies. He taught that disease is the result of violating the laws of God, both natural and spiritual. So the message there is very, very clear. The things of nature are God's blessing provided to give health to body, mind, and soul. They're given to the well to keep them well. So what are vaccines the way we keep well? If you take a vaccine, does that make you safe to go out and eat garbage and to violate all the laws of life and you're not going to get a particular disease? That's a satanic philosophy. It's an immoral philosophy. It's a propagation of sin philosophy. And Western medicine tries to separate prevention from cure. Take a vaccine to prevent, take a drug to cure. Neither are God's method. We'll get into that more deeply. It says, these are more effective in restoring health than all the drug medication in the world. You know, God's healing agencies, as we said, are very simple. I'm just going to give you one quick example here. We're going to talk about this one plant, echinacea. Now, generally the way drugs are, Western drugs, they'll treat one thing. And if you got another problem, you take a second drug. And you got a third problem, you take a third drug. And on the list goes. You go into a nursing home, you'll see people with 30 drugs for 30 different health issues. Well, this is just one plant God made. It's antibacterial. It aids in preventing and reversing pneumonia and influenza. It aids in controlling and normalizing blood sugar. It's an antioxidant and thus supports healthy cell growth. It increases the number and potency of our T lymphocytes, and it also reduces the risk of cancer and supports in the reversal of cancers. It assists in digestion, it lowers blood pressure, it reduces inflammation, it aids in reducing anxiety, and it's effective as a treatment for venomous bites of snakes, reptiles, and insects. And I'll give you some fascinating stories about how potent this medicine is. Most of us just think it's something we take if we get a cold, but it has many, many other properties. God is very ingenious. No one can equal his genius. I talked to an Adventist woman down in Texas. She developed a simple mixture of 4 different herbal remedies. Within an hour, it'll completely reverse malaria, 100% of the time, no matter how serious the case is, and with no side effects. Very simple healing agencies. They work far better than any drug has ever worked or ever will work, and no side effects. So the question is, well, what is a drug? That's an interesting question. We talk here about Dr. Mervyn Harding, who graduated from Stanford University in the mid-50s in pharmacology. For many years, he served as chairman of the Loma Linda School of Medicine's Department of Pharmacology. He later went on to become the Health Ministries Director for our church worldwide. Well, a few years after he had retired from the university, he gave a lecture at Adventist Hinsdale Hospital on the question or topic of what is a drug. And I listened to this lecture. It was quite fascinating. He said throughout his entire professional career at the university, he believed that God's counsel through Ellen White against drugs over time became less frequent and less emphatic, until finally towards the end of her life, she said very little on the subject. And then he said, after I retired, I decided to really study this issue out, and I was shocked to discover the exact opposite. As time went on and she neared the end of her life, the frequency of her counsel against drugs became much, much more common. And as well, the tone of voice and the clarity and the power and the intensity of her messages became more pronounced. So it was the exact opposite of what he'd expected. And he was counseling these doctors that they need to try and get away from drugs, because he talked about drugs that you take now and 10 years later you're getting cancer from having taken that drug. And he mentioned some specific drugs. And so he realized he made a major mistake in his career, but tragically it was too late for all those hundreds and probably thousands of medical students who he taught. It's very sad. We have here Kenneth H. Wood. How many of you remember who Kenneth H. Wood was? He was a wonderful leader in our church, for many years editor of the Review and Herald. In his last years, he served on the Ellen G. White estate. And he wrote one time when he was editor of the Review and Herald an editorial which showed a lot of candor and courage. And he basically said, we've marveled our marvelous health message because we've turned from God's prescribed healing methods to the drugs of allopathy. And you know, he was really attacked for this by church leadership for having spoken this truth. Even though he's a very, old man at the time and very wise, very sad. He never said a word about it for the rest of his life that I know of, because he was severely reprimanded. It says here that the powers of healing, as we understand the laws of nature, have been supplanted by modern drugs, which claim to absolve us from suffering the results of our sinful ways of life in disregarding God's spiritual and natural laws. It says here in Medical Ministry, page 227, thousands have gone down to the grave because of the use of poisonous drugs, which might have been restored to health by simple methods of treatment. Here we see the fact that although modern medicine has a few good things, it's like when you mix truth and error, you always have some truth and some error, otherwise we disregard it. So their ability to diagnose certain diseases is excellent. They're very good in caring for certain types of emergencies. If you get in a car accident, if you get a bullet wound, if you break a leg, great, go and get your bones set, go and get the bullet taken out, go and get the body restructured. And I'm reminded of an incredible story I heard. It's sort of not part of the message. When I worked with Elder Leroy Moore, he mentioned he knew a pastor, an Adventist pastor, was in a severe car accident, ended up with every single bone in his body broken. He was in the hospital. They don't know how he was still alive. They went in and they anointed him. He was like jelly, his whole body. And there were 4 or 5 pastors anointed him. And within half an hour, he got up out of bed and walked home. God can do those kind of miracles today. But as a rule, he employs the laws of nature. But the vastly larger field of treating chronic conditions like cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular degeneration, autoimmune disorders. And by the way, I'll talk about it tomorrow. Is everyone here going to be here tomorrow? Otherwise, maybe I'll mention it. I was listening to this lecture by Robert Kennedy Jr., the son of Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother. And he mentioned that since the year 1989, with all the new vaccines, and they've been multiplying and multiplying, and the government prescribed regime for children keeps going up and up and up. Very, very high, incredible what's going on, very tragic. He said there are roughly 400 new diseases that have been developed by vaccines. And the drug industry generates $50 billion a year in vaccine sales, and they generate $400 billion a year in treating the diseases caused by vaccines. So they multiply like 400 to 500 billion a year. So it's like almost a tenfold increase in income just from the diseases they've created. Robert Kennedy Jr. Okay. Let's continue here. I mentioned this last night about how there are only 4 drugs that this man considered safe in the entire pharmacopoeia of over 1,000 drugs. And he talked about the fact that these drugs cause perforated ulcers, brain damage, addiction, cancer, cardiac arrest, and death. We talked about that briefly last night. I also mentioned last evening the book, Death by Medicine, which has found that modern medicine is responsible for approximately 784,000 deaths per year in this country, making it more deadly than cardiovascular disease and more deadly than cancer. The leading cause of death in our country is now Western medicine, iatrogenic causes of death. In 1983, physicians went on strike in Israel. I mentioned doctor strikes last night. And the Tel Aviv newspaper headline read, "Doctors on strike, morticians beg for bread." In fact, death rates, as I mentioned, drop anywhere from 40 to 60% within a week to 10 days when doctors strike. It mentions here in the British Medical Journal, there was an article that said, "Doctors' strike in Israel may be good for health. The number of funerals performed has fallen drastically." Anyway. Western drug-oriented medicine traces its lineage back to Aesculapius, who was an ancient Greek and Roman demigod, the son of Apollo, who was the sun god, and a mortal woman who was made pregnant by this highly revered god of ancient paganism. Then we have, in Western medicine, the twin serpent-entwined caduceus symbol with the wings. The wings represent the winged serpent of the Garden of Eden, the devil. And the fact that it's with Mercury means this is taken with speed. And it's called the magic wand of Hermes. And Hermes was the messenger of the gods, the inventor of magic incantations, conductor of the dead, and protector of merchants and thieves. Remember in Revelation it talks about all the merchants are going to moan when Babylon falls? Well, the fall is coming. And these kind of caduceus power wands are commonly sold at occult stores and witchcraft stores. Oh, I think we lost. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. It says the pharmaceutical symbol RX was in ancient times an I with an X below it instead of an R. It was called the Eye of Horus. And Horus was the Egyptian god who was considered the god of war and the god of pharmacy. And you know, Western medicine is always waging wars on disease. I talked about that yesterday. But their war isn't upon disease, their war is upon the human constitution. God's messenger says disease is a healing process that the body initiates to restore right conditions in our system. We should not make war upon the process, but understand it and work with it and help it to achieve its task more efficiently. According to Galatians 5, verses 19 through 20, it says, "The acts of our fallen nature are obvious. They are sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, and pharmakeia." We'll talk a little bit more about pharmakeia. Pharmakeia is a Greek word found in the original Koine Greek biblical text. It means pharmacy, magic, and sorcery. The root pharmakon refers to a druggist, a poisoner, or a giver of potions to produce magical effects. So you remember seeing the pictures of the witch with her cauldron and her brew making her potions for magic? That's what Western drugging essentially is, a system of magic. They promise to absolve you from your physical sins if you take our potion. And what I mentioned as well yesterday, that the original root of the word pharmakon or pharmakeia was pharmacia, which was a demonic spirit, an evil spirit that was the keeper of a poison spring, the protector of this poison spring. And that's why all drugs are poisons. And that's why we need to understand that God has given us a better way to heal, the right way. The prophet John, looking on the panorama of Earth's history, warned in Revelation 18, verse 23, that a time would come when Babylon would rule, the merchants of Babylon would rule the earth, and by her sorceries, her pharmakeia, all the nations were deceived. And if we've ever seen a time when all the nations are being deceived, it's under this so-called pandemic. It's all propaganda. If you hear the lecture this afternoon, I'm going to go into a lot of detail as to the falsity of this propaganda, and I'll give you the true science behind what's really going on, because it's heavily suppressed by the mainstream media, which are essentially tools of propaganda. The merchants and thieves are after your money, and in the meantime, they're destroying your soul as you depend upon them to prevent and reverse this so-called pandemic disease. It's a mass deception going on right now. Once I attended an international health convention, and at that convention, in the largest hotel in Toronto, Canada, there was a large group, maybe 3 or 4 times larger than the number here, and the presenters were a group from a community in Scotland called Finehorn, and it was a spiritualist community. And I didn't know that until I got into the presentation, then it all started coming together. And they were talking about their incredible program. And they had these beautiful fruits and vegetables being shown on the slides and the screen. And when they were asked, well, how did these things grow so large? What did you do to the soil? Oh, we work with the spirits. The spirits bless what we grow, and we get these massive, wonderful produce. And so after the presentation, they had questions and answers. I had a doctor sitting next to me who I'd brought to work with me in Ottawa. And I asked the question, I said, are you aware that the unseen spirits, these unseen intelligences, always position themselves and come across to our vision, to our understanding, as being beneficent and healing and helping. But in reality, evil always presents itself in that way. That is how they get their foothold. And we have to be very cautious when dealing with unseen agencies. And when I said that, the speaker became beet red in the face, and he pounded the lectern and said, there is no such thing as evil spirits. And you could hear all the people sort of mumbling. And the doctor sitting next to me jumped to his feet. He said, well, I've worked in native communities up north. I think he worked up, where was it? Up somewhere near Kenora, north of here. And he said, I've seen people taken by spirits and brought low. And the only thing that brought them back was when I read the 23rd Psalm and prayed for them. And then there was more rumbling in the room. And then it quieted down and went to other questioners. And suddenly I felt a tug on the back of my jacket. I turned around, and the man says to me, he says, well, I want you to know this. He says, I never, ever prescribe a drug to any of my patients until I've consulted the spirits first. Yeah. Anyway. We should never dare to dismiss God's true healing methods as quackery, and that's exactly what Western medicine has done. There was a man named Warren Peters, an Adventist physician, who used to be the health director at Heartland Institute for their lifestyle program. And he wrote a book entitled Mystical Medicine, in which he essentially said all forms of healing, all forms of natural healing, all forms of herbal medicine are satanic, and allopathic medicine is God's true healing system. And his book was an exact lie, an exact reversal of the truth. He actually believed that. It says, woe to them who call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness. Isaiah 5 and verse 20. It says, is a warning in Amos chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Now this is talking to people who are in compromise. people who are disregarding God's counsel, people who think they're saved when they're not. We're told that God's grace, Christ's blood, cannot cover unconfessed and unforsaken sin. So we have to turn from our evil ways if we will live. It isn't enough just to say, I'm sorry, Lord, and we go back and repeat our sins. God wants reform, revival, reformation, reform. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord, for what good is that day of the Lord to you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or as though he went into the house, leaned his hand upon the wall, and a serpent bit him. So, God's giving fair warning. Don't deceive yourself. Walk in all the light of my truth if you're looking forward to Jesus' return. And then you'll be ready to meet him without spot and blameless. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 47, is a wonderful vision that the prophet was given. And this vision was about the end time. He described waters flowing from under the threshold of the temple. And it came up to the waist, and it was so deep that to cross it, one had to swim to cross it. And it entered into the sea, and all the waters of the sea were healed. And wherever this river flowed, it brought life and healing. And along this river there were trees that bore beautiful fruit and leaves. And this fruit, it said, would be for food, and the leaves for medicine. God's messenger tells us in Counsels on Health that this vision represents the great health message, the great health work that God has given to his people, the right arm of the three angels' message. It is to become an integral part of our message to a fallen world. And we're told that this is to be taken to every people upon the earth, so that the waters of God's healing, the waters of this healing message, go to all peoples throughout the earth. That is to be our mission as his people. Many years ago, I worked for a time under contract with the North American Division. And I was down at Monument Valley Mission when we owned that mission. It's been sold since then. This is on the Utah-Arizona border. And I was invited to speak down in Kayenta at a Navajo teachers conference. They had maybe 150 teachers there, principals, teachers. And I presented on the issue of true healing methods. And Native people are quite interested in traditional plant medicine and natural healing. So my message was very welcome. And I shared a lot of principles of true healing and went into a lot of detail into the 8 laws of health. And after I finished presenting, one of the speakers, I believe she was a principal there in Kayenta, she said, I've got to share a testimony. She said, many years ago, I came down with a very serious sickness. I was told I was going to die. I was told by my doctors I only had one chance of survival if I flew to Salt Lake City and underwent major surgery. I had a 50% chance of surviving. And she said, something said to me, go up to the Monument Valley Mission and see what they tell you to do. And at the time, she didn't say this, but at the time there was an Adventist doctor there who only used God's healing methods. She went up there, met this doctor. He put on a very simple program of changed diet, of other factors, certain plant medicines, and he sort of monitored what was happening. She said, in a matter of weeks, I was feeling like a new person, and I completely recovered. And when she said all of this, when she shared all this, the whole room became electrified. They said, are they still practicing that kind of medicine up there? And I was never so embarrassed in my life. I had to say no. The doctor who treated this lady is no longer there. And as I thought about it, if they'd been using God's healing methods, they would have thousands of Navajo converts to the handful they now have. And the same is true of our church. We would not have 20 million members by now. We might have 200 or 400 million members. Because we've disregarded God's counsel, we are paying the price in delaying his advent, and many souls will be lost for eternity. It's very sad. We're told that to make plain natural law and to urge obedience to it is the work that will accompany the Christian gospel message and prepare a people for the coming of the Lord. And we're also told that the great final test, remember we know what's coming, the National Sunday Law, then the Global Sunday Law, We're no longer going to be able to buy and sell. It says, as we approach this great final test, this test must come to our churches in relationship or connection with a true healing work, a work that has the great physician to dictate and preside in all it comprehends. I believe as we disregard God's counsel on health and healing, that he cannot then use us in a powerful way to give the complete message to the world. And we're setting ourselves up to accept this great deception. And you know, it's very tragic that the leadership in our church, the physicians in our church, this I'm going to call it this fake pandemic, they bought it hook, line, and sinker. Our churches have been closed. I've seen Baptist pastors get up and tear apart their non-circumvention they're what is it called? Their cease and desist orders. They tore them right up in public on television. We take our direction from the God of heaven. We don't take it from the world system in Babylon. And I've never heard an Adventist pastor get up and dare say that. It's very sad. Let's continue here. It says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive that which is done in their body, according to what they have done, whether it be good or whether it be bad. So everything we do has a consequence. And this is my last slide. It says, do not quench the Spirit of God. Do not despise prophecies. Test all things. Hold fast what is good. Abstain from every form of evil. And may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely. And may your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless until the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So I thank you. That's the conclusion of our message. And I'm exactly 1 minute over, just like it was yesterday. Okay, so let's have a word of prayer as we close. Our gracious